I've spoken of the shining city all my political life, but I don't know if I ever quite communicated what I saw when I said it. But in my mind, it was a tall, proud city built on rocks stronger than oceans, windswept, God-blessed, and teeming with people of all kinds living in harmony and peace. And if there had to be city walls, the walls had doors, and the doors were open to anyone with the will and the heart to get here.
A new UN report reveals that the world's refugee crisis is getting worse.
An all-time high of close to 60 million refugees.
A 40% increase within the span of just 3 years.
Syria remains, for the last couple of years, the largest single driver of this.
We must understand why people are risking their lives. They are fleeing war, political instability, and insecurity to seek a better future.
We cannot repeat the dark days of the 1930s, when many Americans resolved to turn away the helpless refugees fleeing Nazi Germany. Those mistakes were based on misguided fears of people we didn't know.
You don't know who they are. It's difficult to vet them. I think we would like better assurances. General King, do you have any thoughts on that?
I don't know how the United States of America can possibly say no to people who are pouring out of that country. We've had 1 million come here since 9/11, all seeking political asylum. This is who we are.
I think it's important to remember what Franklin Roosevelt said about the only thing we have to fear is fear itself. In America, we understand who we are, we know what our values are. It's inappropriate for America, of all countries in the world, to panic and to somehow turn our backs on our fundamental values.
I'm Abramowitz. Thank you, Elisa, for your nice introduction, and welcome to all of you to this program. And I'm really thrilled to be on this panel with two great colleagues, Elisa Massimino, the Executive Director of Human Rights First, and Aleinikoff, who is just back from, I believe, a 5-year stint as the Deputy High Commissioner for Refugees in Geneva. Because we're here at the Museum of Jewish History with a great focus on the Holocaust, because I come from the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum, I thought that it might be useful to set the stage for our conversation tonight by talking a little bit about a different refugee crisis. We at the museum have been, for obvious reasons, it's impossible to work at the Holocaust Museum without thinking about what happened in the 1930s and 1940s. It's actually the subject of a special exhibition that we're going to be working on that's going to open in April 2018, looking at the American responses to the Holocaust. And so I want to show you some images tonight that are drawn from some of the research we've been doing for this next exhibition, because I think it's very relevant to the subject at hand tonight. So these are headlines from the New York Times. They seem very familiar. Refugee problem entangles Europe. Refugee problem grows more complex. Next slide. These are from 1938 and 1940. This is the parallels, their differences, and it's important to recognize that there are differences, but in some ways we've seen this story before. Next slide, please. In the 1930s, it was really hard for Jews in Germany to get out. These were some of the these are some of the requirements that were required for Jews in Germany or elsewhere to get a visa before the war started in 1939. And this is on top of the requirements that the Nazis imposed on Jews to get out. Next slide, please. 1939, that's the St. Louis on the right. Refugee ship famously turned away from Cuba, United States. It's a cartoon from the New York Daily Mirror. You know, one of the great icons of our culture is the Statue of Liberty, and we didn't quite live up to it in the late 1930s. Next slide, please. We hear a lot of discussion today about the security problems potential refugees coming to our country. Well, this was an issue back in 1939, 1940. This was a very big movie in Hollywood in 1939, starring Edward G. Robinson, Confessions of a Nazi Spy, and raised the concerns that were very rife at that period of a fifth column entering our country. Next slide, please. This is an incredible poll. We've been looking a lot at public opinion polling, 1939. It's been proposed that the government permit 10,000 refugee children to be brought into this country. This is the Wagner-Rogers Act. And 2/3 of all Americans at the time were opposed to permitting refugee children into the country. Next slide, please. Look, these are cartoons by Dr. Seuss, Theodore Geisel. He wasn't known as Dr. Seuss then. He was doing amazing cartoons for PM Magazine. And look at the slide on the right, the cartoon on the right. And the wolf chewed up the children and spit out their bones. But those were foreign children, and it didn't really matter. Pretty biting. Next slide, please. You know, one of the things that we want to think about is that the response to the refugee crisis in the 30s, it's not just the government, but also individuals. And if the government at the time of the 1930s was not, acting as aggressively as we might like in retrospect, individuals stepped up. This is an amazing Philadelphia couple, Gilbert and Eleanor Krauss, who in 1940 traveled to Vienna and personally arranged for 50 German children to be brought as foster children essentially to Philadelphia. Just as the war was raging in Europe, they were a Jewish couple, and those were the 50 children who came to Philadelphia and were saved from Nazism. Next slide, please. Amazing statistic. After everything we learned in the Holocaust, a poll was done in December 1945, should we permit more people from Europe to come to this country? And there was actually widespread opposition, even to more, after everything that we've been through with the Holocaust. And that's not an unfamiliar statistic. I was very struck, the Pew polling, the Pew Charitable Trust did a poll a couple months ago. They looked at polling from throughout history. Every time there's a major refugee crisis, not just today, but during the Holocaust, the Hungarian refugee crisis in 1956, the Indochina refugee crisis, there's been opposition to allowing refugees into our country. So I just thought I would just use that to kind of give you a little bit of sense of the history that we're dealing with when we're dealing with the issues that we're going to talk about today. So I think I would like to start our conversation with Alex. You just saw my slides, and I'd be very curious if you can, put the current crisis into some context. It's been said that this is the greatest refugee crisis since the Holocaust. Is that accurate? And can you sort of, in just broad terms, get us started by describing the current crisis?
It's accurate. There are more than, you saw the numbers here, more than 60 million people displaced from their homes because of conflict and violence. About a third of them have crossed an international border, and under international law they're considered refugees. Another 2/3 are within their home countries. We call them internally displaced people, or IDPs. The numbers have gone up dramatically over the last 4 or 5 years. Syria being the main example. There are probably 11 or 12 million displaced people from Syria, 4 million refugees outside of Syria, 7 or 8 million inside Syria displaced. And the numbers are huge. In Turkey, 2.5 million refugees. In Lebanon, a country of 4 million people, 1 million refugees accepted by Lebanon. Now those countries have begun to tighten their borders and say, we can't take any more. And in part, that's the reason for the movement now towards Europe, either people leaving Syria directly or more likely in situations where they've been for 3 or 4 or 5 years inside these neighboring countries of Syria, living in very difficult situations and wanting to get on with their lives and better lives. And so what has been a crisis in the region for 4 years suddenly became a crisis in the rest of the world when 1 million people said we can't take it anymore and started coming to Europe and faced very difficult situations crossing the Mediterranean. You've all seen pictures of boats that have gone down and overloaded, and several thousand people have lost their lives in the Mediterranean, and now people coming through the land route in the middle of winter up to Europe and meeting with very different responses from the European countries. But Syria is just one of the crises over the last 4 or 5 years. I'd like to take one more minute to say. But crises in South Sudan, in the Central African Republic, in Nigeria, in Mali, all these places have sent hundreds of thousands of people across borders. And the most recent data I've seen, in the first half of 2015, there were more than 800,000 new refugees in the world, which means about 5,000 refugees a day created in the last 6 months.
Alex, I just want to ask one more question before I bring in Elisa. Of that 11 million or so people who've been displaced and 4 or 5 million people who've left the country, there's a very particular definition of refugees, which you're probably better familiar with than I am, but it has to do with fleeing, having a well-founded fear of persecution. Of those Syrian refugees, how many would you consider pure refugees, and how many would you consider what I guess economic migrants or some other word that's been used?
Look, the world has treated any Syrian who has fled across the border as a refugee. There hasn't been any question about economic migrants coming from Syria.
But that's what you're in Europe, though.
Not so much. That's usually directed at other nationalities. I think no European country is sending Syrians back to Syria. They're recognized as refugees. There have been other questions about other nationalities, sub-Saharan, Eritrean, Afghan. There are people coming from other places that people have some questions about. But the Syrians have been treated as refugees.
Okay. So, Elisa, I want to bring you in. What would you say, in general, has been the response of the world? I'd like to stick with the Syrian refugee crisis. What would you say has been the response of the world to that crisis? And if you can look both, I think 3 specific layers. One, the neighbors of Syria, then Europe, and then maybe the United States as well.
Sure. Well, I mean, Alex just spoke about the neighborhood, Syria's neighborhood, which, as in most refugee crises in the world, it's the neighboring countries that bear the brunt. And in part because most of us would feel the same way. Everyone hopes to go home at some point. And, in this country, we sometimes labor under the kind of delusion that if only that everybody would want to come here if they could, and really most people want to go home and they hope that they can go home. Now Syrians, very few Syrians that my colleagues just got back just a few days ago from a mission to Jordan, Lebanon, and Turkey, and most Syrians now have given up all hope of going back anytime soon. Their country is destroyed. But the neighboring countries are the ones bearing the brunt, and because the donations from other countries to the humanitarian relief effort have not met the need, many of these countries now are closing their borders, either intermittently or completely. My colleagues talked to refugees who had relatives who were, turned back to Syria, which is, that's the crux of to the extent coming out of the Holocaust and coming out of the refugee crisis of World War II, the world came together and defined what a refugee is, and then said that all nations should, at the very least, refrain from sending refugees back to a place of persecution. It doesn't say that everybody's got to take a certain number and all of that. But it does say you can't push people back into situations of danger. But that is what's starting to happen now, even with the human rights basket case of Syria, because these countries are now laboring, and I don't know, what is it in Jordan now, as a quarter of the population practically is refugees. So it's been a tremendous burden. In Europe, as you've seen, and it's, Alex could probably speak to the details of this, but it was interesting how, this refugee crisis has been going on for a very long time. We're now entering the 6th year of the Syrian war. But really, most people started to pay attention last year. Why is that? Because it broke out of the neighborhood. And in part, that was because People were running out of food. They were in camps. They were unable to work in the in the host countries. More and more restrictions placed by the host governments, and children going for years without being educated. And parents, as any of us would, said, "There's no future here for us." That's what drives people to do this incredibly dangerous thing, which is take to these unseaworthy rafts and boats and try to make it to Europe. So then you have the crisis spreading out. And the Europeans, Angela Merkel, I think, was tremendously forward-leaning. How long that can last politically for her? I mean, Europe is a very complicated place in terms of harmonization of asylum and refugee policy. And now there is a huge backlash going on with lots of countries starting to say, no, we don't want to take any. In the meantime, you have countries like the United States, far geographically from the crisis, and yet, certainly from a foreign policy perspective, very involved, and taking just the tiniest fraction. In terms of Syrian refugees alone, I think we've settled less than 2,000. Just the tiniest fraction. And there are a number of reasons, we can talk about it, for that. But the United States, we think of ourselves, the Statue of Liberty is our symbol, and the rest of the world does look to what the United States does. At Human Rights First, our mission is about fostering American global leadership on human rights. And so it's hugely problematic when the United States is not doing more on the resettlement side. Now, in terms of financially, the U.S. is head and shoulders above almost every country. It's the biggest donor to the humanitarian fund to relieve the situation for Syrian refugees in particular, and is the biggest donor to UNHCR. But that is not matched by equal generosity in terms of resettlement. And then there are countries that should be doing something who have just completely, Russia, the Gulf states, who have done almost nothing.
Let me pick up a question on that, Elisa, for both of you guys. This issue has become obviously a very hot topic on the campaign trails in the United States, and all sorts of comments being made by various candidates about what we should or should not be doing. Can both of you address the issue of these? That's none of us, by the way. These refugees, they're being hosted primarily in countries like Jordan, Lebanon, Turkey, Northern Iraq. They've now gone to Europe. Why is it the United States' responsibility to actually resettle more refugees? Why would, what is wrong with the argument that these are, that these, as I've heard on the campaign trail, these people should be taken care of by the neighbors, or by where they go? Why is it our responsibility to deal with them?
The international refugee system only works if there is responsibility sharing across the world. And right now we have a situation where what Peter Sutherland, who is the Secretary General's Special Representative for Migration and Development, has described as responsibility by proximity. That it's the neighboring countries that have borne the burden. But if it is only the neighboring countries that bear the burden, they will stop admitting people, which is what Elisa said. They will stop caring for people. So the system only works if everybody does their fair share around the world. Because there'll be a crisis in another part of the world or closer to home, and we will want people to help as well.
Well, do you think it's being noted by the neighbors the United States is not taking? In your kind of conversations you've had in Geneva?
I won't comment on those conversations, but it's absolutely noticed that the United States is not living up to its obligations on the resettlement side. Canada is taking took 25,000 Syrians. The new Prime Minister flew a plane to take people out of the region and bring them to Canada. Our president announced 10,000, and there was political opposition to taking 10,000 instead of 25,000. Look, you mentioned historically, even after, with the opposition, with the polls you showed, after World War II, 400,000 people came to the United States under the Displaced Persons Act. 700,000 Cubans came in the 60s and 70s. 100,000 Vietnamese were welcomed after the Vietnam War. So the numbers we're talking about are way below historical numbers that the United States should be taking. And it's distressing that our refugee response has gotten in the middle of a political debate that works to the disadvantage of the most desperate people around the world.
Just to add to that, other governments are not the only ones that are noticing the failure of the United States to take in more Syrian refugees. My colleagues, as I said, who just got back from the region, talked to refugees themselves who are, who know that the United States is not stepping up, and who even are aware of the political debate going on here about legislation that would block resettlement of Syrian and Iraqi refugees. And, as is sometimes, and actually increasingly the case, I would argue that, and some of our national security experts have argued that not only is it our moral responsibility as part of the international community to take more refugees, but strategically it's in our national security interest. You hear a lot of national security concerns about it could be terrorists and the refugee flows, and I know we're going to talk about that. But very few people talk about the national security risks of failing to assist our allies in the region who are bearing the brunt of this, and also to demonstrate to the Syrian people who have fled the brutality of ISIS and Assad's barrel bombs that we stand with them. These are, there's a generation of children growing up in refugee camps and in outside of camps in the region who are learning the lessons of who stood by them and who didn't.
Lisa, let me just pick up on that national security issue. I mean, clearly, just to put it plainly, I think one of the major concerns in our country has to do with the concern that someone from Syria is going to slip into this country and set up a car bomb or something like that. There are very sincere, I think, national security concerns that have been voiced by many people. Are those concerns legitimate? I'd like both of you to kind of answer that question, and what kind of steps are being taken to make sure that that kind of thing does not happen?
Yeah. Well, I can say that there are a lot of steps. There's so many steps that I was going to do a slide, but the steps don't fit on one slide. So in terms of the U.S. screening of refugees for admission, just the standard one, and then there's a special layer of security screening for Syrian refugees. 5 different aids. There's screening by UNHCR first, before the U.S. even gets involved. They take biometric data, background information, personal interviews, and most of them are women and children. They've been living in these other host countries in the region for years. And UNHCR, the UN Refugee Agency, has data collected about them through interactions throughout the time that they've been in these countries. And then the United States, for any refugees that are going to come here, does its own very extensive, so extensive, in fact, that's part of the reason why we haven't resettled more Syrian refugees. The president, as Alex said, the president has set this number at 10,000. But one of the reasons why it may be hard to reach that target is that the security clearance screening process is so extensive. It involves DHS, the CIA and the intelligence agencies, the National Counterterrorism Center, the State Department, biometric data, and there's a time limit on it. So if you don't get through the process soon enough, it starts over again. So it's a very extensive process. And in terms of foreigners that come into the country, it's probably the most extensive process. And there are lots of other, we have, I don't know how many foreign nationals who come into the United States every day, every week. And of course they go through some security screening, but it's nothing like what refugees go through. So it's a relatively small number of people compared to other foreigners who are coming into the United States, and a much higher level of scrutiny.
Alex, how is the security situation seen in Europe? I mean, obviously there are people that are showing up on the shores of Greece without the kind of security that's going on here. How are the European governments approaching this? Do they have the same kind of concerns that government officials here have voiced? Well,
I think everybody has concerns about security and about the possibility of terrorism. be silly not to. It's just that you can't solve that through an asylum system. You solve that through other ways. I mean, Germany has accepted 1 million asylum seekers without screening. And eventually people will be screened, and if the intelligence community is aware of particular people, they'll find them and take them out or stop them from coming in. They've taken 1 million people into their country, Syrian refugees. The idea that we can't take 10,000 or have difficulty getting into 10,000 is really troubling. And even on the, as Elisa said, the United States hands out 1 million green cards a year. 1 million people get green cards in this country. Tens of thousands of them are Muslims. And we somehow go on.
Well, in Germany, has that been, I mean, it strikes me just from looking at the headlines in the last month or so, it looks like there is some backlash against Apple's approach to that.
But of course there's backlash, and there's been criminal conduct by some people apparently, in terms of the way the harassment of women on the streets in a couple of different European cities, and that has to be taken care of. No one thinks lawbreakers should be admitted or people who break the law should be able to stay. You have to have a serious law enforcement effort. But the idea that you close down an entire system that's helping people who are, who have been through hell to get out of their country is just crazy to me. I've been to these camps. I've been in the camps in Jordan. I've walked in the settlements. Lebanon doesn't have camps, where refugees are in settlements. And you see the people there. It's women and young children and people who've been desperate to get out. And the idea that every single one of these people is such a security threat that we hold up for 2 or 3 years their ability to come into the country is just wrong.
The United Nations is planning a conference for the fall on looking at this whole crisis. Are there elements of kind of a deal that could come out of this conference that would, you think, alleviate the current problems?
I think so. There are several conferences actually happening. There's a conference this week in London that will try to raise additional money. There's a conference in March on the Syria crisis that it's talked about as legal pathways for Syrian refugees. And what people are beginning to think about is not only admitting people as refugees, but there may be many people who have family members who can be admitted on family visas, who may have skills, they can come in on labor visas. So people are looking at other ways to alleviate the burden in the neighbors, as Elisa put it. What's happening in September is even a broader conference. This will be announced. Actually, the United States and the UN have both announced conferences for the same day at the General Assembly. We'll need to work out exactly who does what on this. But it's even a broader discussion of large movements of refugees and migrants. And we've been focusing on Syria, which, well, we should. But be aware that, I mean, in some ways, the real problem, the most intractable problem in our international refugee system is not the handling of emergency flows. That's where the money goes. That's where people go. It's these long-standing refugee situations that don't get solved. It's 1 million Somali refugees. It's 2 million Afghan refugees. It's hundreds of thousands of South Sudanese refugees who are outside their country for years. And the real work that has to be done at this conference is to think more broadly about how you overcome what UNHCR calls protracted refugee situations where people spend a lifetime as a refugee.
Well, you're raising you're giving me a segue to an issue that I'd like both of you to comment on. I mean, it strikes me that one of the issues that you're touching upon is the fact that in some ways dealing with refugees is kind of not really dealing with the heart of the problem. You've got these intractable political problems, I mean, foremost in Syria today, but also South Sudan, Eastern Congo, other countries. The root causes of these problems are really not being addressed by the international community. And when you look at, what countries are really focusing on, they do not seem to be focusing on really the political steps that are necessary to avoid having future refugees, which, by the way, are the steps that are also necessary to avoid having future genocides in some cases.
It's so true. The refugees essentially are kind of partaking in this self-help atrocity prevention, right?
Yes.
They're getting out while they still can. And it's so true that, of course, and you hear this in almost every refugee crisis, that, well, the real solution is solving the underlying problem. And of course that's true, and I think we need to be talking about that. And the U.S. in particular has a lot it should be doing about the Syrian crisis and all these others. but that can't be seen as a substitute for helping the people who are already exposed and at risk. We have to do both. We have to do both. And you know, we haven't mentioned, it's a much smaller, but still it's close to home, so it feels bigger, crisis over our southern border with tens of thousands of women, mostly women and children, fleeing Central America, Guatemala, El Salvador, Honduras. You know, at least one and possibly two of those approaching kind of a failed state almost status, where law enforcement is not able to protect them from gang violence, from horrific domestic violence. And these are tiny numbers compared to some of these other crises, and yet what you saw the Obama administration do was, you know, initially put them all in detention, threaten to send people back without adequate hearings, using detention as a deterrent, and you know, putting mothers and babies in jail-like facilities in the middle of the desert. So we've got a lot of work to do, even close to home.
I'd like to come back to the issue of the frontline states for a second. 2 years ago, I went to Jordan on a mission for our museum. At our museum, we have a committee on conscience, which Alex is now on. Thank you for serving on that. And we try to raise awareness of potential threats of genocide in the world. What was really interesting on the trip that I took to Jordan, and I went to the places you did, you know, Zatri, went to the border. But then Jordan, I'm guessing, had maybe about 600,000 refugees. And by the way, a lot of them are not living in the camps. They're actually living in the cities. And that was actually something that was quite a shock to me as someone who's not an expert on this. How many are, you know, living, you know, in the community among us? You know, this is 2 years ago, and there were concerns about, you know, a country like Jordan, which is really complicated politically and being destabilized by this. Now we're 2 years later, as best as I can tell, there really hasn't been made much progress in this kind of global compact, which you were essentially talking about. There are more refugees in Jordan, there are more refugees in Lebanon, there are more refugees in northern Iraq. You now have ISIS, which really, honestly, is a factor of the last 2 years. We hadn't heard of ISIS 2 years ago. So what is the risk of these countries, do you think, Alex, being destabilized by the crisis? Is this something that could, in addition to being a humanitarian crisis, could this become a national security crisis for us?
Elisa already said this, that there are security, broader global security issues here. Sure. I mean, this is an issue that has to be dealt with. And that's why the idea of global responsibility sharing here is so important. It's actually, when you think about it, go back to Lebanon with 1 million refugees in the country, 4 million, it's really startling that it has continued to exist and go on, given the burden it had. Now, in the long run, I mean, the other way to, I mean, I don't want to overstate this because, you know, I think part of the problem of the discourse is that refugees are seen as a burden. And when you get a large number of people into a new community, of course, it's going to have an impact on water and electricity and schools and hospitals. But as things become more normalized, we are now beginning to gather evidence that shows that refugees are a benefit for communities. A lot of the Syrians came with skills, they came with money and capital. They're opening businesses in Turkey. If they're given the authority to work, the permission to work, Lisa said most are not, they're not. They will contribute in the long run to their communities in ways that should strengthen those communities. So I don't want to only paint them as people who are destabilizing countries and causing security problems. They're an added workforce to these countries in the long run and to the countries that accept them. And one of the reasons that Germany has been so open is because Germany needs more workers.
You know, one thing I often think about in the context of the history of this museum and my museum, think of the incredible brain drain from Germany, the people who left, Einstein, Freud, you know, the people. It's not just the famous intellectuals, but it's also, you know, in Syria, a large number of the middle class has exited. And so, did you want to say something, Elisa?
Well, I just wanted to say that both, not just Germany, but more broadly, most European countries and the United States, if you look at our long-term economic model, we need immigrants. That's just, I think, a fact. Our population is not growing to keep up with the need. And so there's so many stories of refugees who have gone on to do, make amazing contributions. You know, my organization, Human Rights First, we have one of the largest and most successful pro bono representation programs for those lucky few people who actually make it here and seek asylum and are not in the resettlement pipeline. And we leverage about $40 million of in-kind contributions from private law firms to assist refugees. And we have a little clip to give an example of what that looks like, and I think it would be useful for people in the context of this. I don't know if you have it teed up over there, but there's a short clip from a news piece about a Syrian refugee who sought asylum here. And
that's great. While we're teeing it up, I just want I'm going to turn to the audience in a minute or two for some questions. So you should be thinking about questions for the panelists, but maybe we can show the clip quickly.
Back in Syria, Elisa was an active leader in the struggle for free Syria. She was arrested multiple times, spending no less than 52 days in prison. In 2011, when she decided her safest option was to flee the country, she was smuggled into Turkey and eventually landed in Switzerland. She was granted asylum in the United States after receiving pro bono representation through the organization Human Rights First, arriving in Maryland in 2012. She joins us now from Washington, D.C. Good morning.
Hi, good morning.
Take me back to those days first days of protest in Syria. Did people feel like, although this was a more multicultural place, like this was Syria's version of the Arab Spring?
Yes, Syrians started their uprising peacefully. They were marching in streets calling for freedom, and I was among them. I was one of them. I was a student in Aleppo University. We didn't know back then that the Assad regime would be that brutal against his own people. We didn't know that ISIS, like foreigners, will come from other states and establish their so-called Islamic State in Syria. I was arrested due to peaceful protesting, as many of my secular fellows, Syrians, and there were a gap, and it was filled by radicals who came from other states and established their Islamic State, the so-called Islamic State in Syria.
When you look at what's happening in Syria now, what do you see?
Sorry?
When you look at what's happening in Syria now, what do you see? When you see this massive flood of people trying to get out, trying to escape, what are you trying to escape?
Yes, it is very, very sad what's going on in Syria now. People didn't know that going to happen, all of that to them. It started really peaceful uprising, and now it's horrible. The country is almost destroyed. Hundreds are fleeing the country every day. We have already more than 12 million displaced inside and outside Syria, and there are more flowing of refugees every day. Now we have Russian airplanes striking randomly on people. So Syrians are in a desperate need for help, like politically and also humanitarian level.
Yeah.
Hundreds are fleeing every day, and we need help.
Hadil, just very briefly now, tell me what it means to you to have been able to find safe haven here in the United States.
I'm very thankful and happy I'm just alive again. I was almost dying in Syria. I was in danger. I was threatened by Assad regime to be arrested and maybe killed under torture like a lot of my fellows. And then I found a safe place where I could study again. I'm at college now. I'm doing programming. I have a little daughter who was born here in the United States. I'm married. I'm living safely, and I'm very happy to live in this country that doesn't categorize people into black, white, Christians, Muslims, and I hope that other Syrians can find it and make it safe to America to start from the beginning.
Adil, Elisa, thank you so much for taking the time to tell your story. Do appreciate it.
Thank you.
that's just an example, but it goes to your point, Mike, about atrocity prevention, I think. And, this, if you think about what's the responsibility of the United States and the broader international community, it's hard to remember, but back when this started, it was a peaceful protest with Syrians demanding reform, not even the ouster of Assad at the time. And there was very little engagement from the international community around that. And once it turned violent, and it didn't take but a few years to escalate into the crisis that we're facing now, which is really a generational challenge for the world community.
But, one thing that your clip, a very powerful testimony from that refugee said, she was a Christian. Mm-hmm. One of the things we talked about genocide prevention, actually atrocities, even genocide, are happening today. My colleagues at the museum, part of the Committee on Conscience, we went to northern Iraq last August and did a series of interviews with victims of ISIS, and came away with a conclusion. I mean, it's not a legally, but I think it's grounded in law. We talked to a lot of lawyers. They came to the conclusion that genocide had been perpetrated by ISIS against the Yazidis, a population of about 1 million people in northern Iraq, and that crimes against humanity were being committed against other minority groups, including Christians. So I think the point is, it's not just a hypothetical thing. People are fleeing war, they're fleeing the destruction of the community, but they're also fleeing genocide. And this is something that could have been prevented if we had been more forward-leaning 5 or 6 years ago. I'm going to throw it open to questions, but I want to just ask Alex to circle back to something that I posed at the beginning of this, before we throw it open, which is, in addition to being a practitioner and a policymaker, you're also a scholar, and you've studied these issues. As you look at the current asylum crisis, how is this different or the same from previous crises, whether it's the Holocaust, whether it's the Indochina refugee crisis in the late 70s? What do you think is kind of unique about this period of time?
To put the Holocaust to the side in terms of comparison,
sure.
Of course, but there's some, I'd say a couple of things. In the 1970s, with the Vietnamese crisis, the world came together and put together what was called a comprehensive plan of action, where people were brought in. People may remember the boat people who were drowning on boats escaping. And there was a global compact on how to resolve that problem, and it did resolve the problem. It brought a lot of people to safety. It stopped the flow in a safe way. The world came together to do that. What we have now really is a broken system. We have a broken refugee system where the burden is all on the neighboring countries. As Elisa said, 80% of the refugees live in neighboring countries, and they live there for a very long time. So a system that was supposed to provide emergency relief and then either get people home or get them elsewhere is broken. It's failed. The vast majority of refugees stay refugees for years. So we're not giving them enough help in the emergency stage. And then we're not getting them home. They're not rebuilding their lives. They're not able to start over. And the numbers keep coming. So we have the new refugees every year on top of an existing large number of people whose situations are not being solved. And it really has I think, reached the breaking point.
If I can just follow up, Alex, what role do you think U.S. leadership has in that? Because one thing that's quite interesting about the late 70s, and it's sort of a kind of an unknown part of President Carter's legacy, but he personally, took a lot of leadership in basically opening America's doors to refugees from Indochina, from Cambodia. That was something that
and you saw President Reagan.
Right. But so, how much does U.S. leadership have to be part of the problem?
Well,
Solutions.
America can play a huge role on leading on this. And as Elisa said, the U.S. has been the public and taxpayers have been enormously generous in terms of contributions to organizations that provide for assistance in the regions where refugees are. It's way ahead of any other country in the world. But in terms of getting the world together to work on a global solution to these problems. The United States has to be in the lead. And we'll see. I mean, this is the hope of the September conferences at the UN, that the U.S. will assume that lead and bring others along to say, we have to work on causes, we have to work on taking care of people better in the countries they have first asylum, and finding the solutions to long-term situations and getting people home or safely elsewhere.
Okay, so I've asked enough questions. I'd like to see if there's anyone in the audience who has a question. We have someone with a microphone. What I think I'll try to do is collect a couple questions, starting with the lady in the middle, and then the lady here, and then we'll go from there.
I'm the lady in the middle.
Okay. Hello.
I go by Ruth Ice. I'm a social worker, and I have worked a lot with the undocumented in the United States. And there's such antipathy towards, I think there are 11 million in the United States. I think that a priori, before we discuss taking people in, we have to really address this antipathy. Maybe it's a question of leadership.
Antipathy to undocumented people in this country. Okay, that's a good question. I'd like to just collect some questions. I don't want to, and then we'll let the panelists answer that. I should have said that I think it's probably best, because I want to get as many of this, people just pose a question. Go ahead. You can give her the microphone.
Hi, so just following it in the news, it seems like so many of these crises have an aspect of gendered violence, from the Northern Triangle to kind of the atrocities against Yazidi women and so on, Boko Haram. And I'm just wondering if there's any special consideration, considering that so much of the violence is being perpetrated specifically against women.
Okay. One more question? Over here, sir.
I'd be curious to hear from you, what can I do to most help with this situation?
Okay, that's an awesome question, and one that is very, sadly, sometimes difficult to answer. Okay, so we have three questions. One about the antipathy to undocumented people here in the United States. Number two, to address the issue of gender violence, how much of the refugee flow is being caused by violence against women, and then also the question of what can I do? Maybe, Elisa, why don't you answer?
Sure.
Any of them that you like?
Okay, absolutely. I'll take them in order. The antipathy towards undocumented, I think that, I want to say two things about it. One is that right now in our political environment, I think there is this exaggerated kind of demagoguery by some, I don't even call them political leaders because I don't think that's leadership. But perhaps this is an occupational hazard being a human rights activist, but I'm more optimistic about the American public than I am about some of the people who are talking the loudest about immigrants. In fact, there are many, many polls that show that in large part, the majority of Americans do not have great antipathy towards immigrants, including undocumented. What they do have is a lack of trust that the immigration system, that the government is working or has control of that. So it's not so much directed, in my experience anyway, and looking at some of these polls, toward individual immigrants who come here, who want to work, who don't break the law. I mean, it's, as the large majority of them are law-abiding and tax-paying, even though they're not citizens, people who've come here to better themselves and the lot of their families. And so most Americans don't have so much trouble, I think, with them. But they don't have much faith in the system working very well. They don't like that there are a bunch of people who didn't go through a system that are undocumented. And so fixing that has been a big challenge. So I'm more optimistic when the demagogic voices are quieted down, which, is in our country, we go through cycles on immigration. You saw the slides that Mike was showing from the 30s and 40s, but also we've had periods where there's been very strong bipartisan support for immigration and for refugees in particular. And regaining that, I think, should be a very high priority for us. I know it is for Human Rights First. We were, recently, there was a piece of legislation that passed in the House called the so-called SAFE Act, which would have shut down the resettlement program for Syrians and Iraqis, including Iraqis who helped our military when we were at war in Iraq. It passed the House, but it did not proceed in the Senate, in part because there was a sense of bipartisan. We helped organize this letter that had quite an unusual mix of people signing it, from Henry Kissinger to a former chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, former Chief of Staff of the Army, former National Security Advisor in the Bush administration, a former Secretary of Defense, Republican, who all said that taking Syrian refugees is an imperative for our national security, not a threat to our national security. And that was very bipartisan. So I think that gives me some comfort. On the gendered violence issue, I think you're absolutely right, and it's particularly obvious in the Central American crisis, as you mentioned, that most of the refugees, women and children, are fleeing domestic violence, horrible domestic violence. And our refugee system has not been progressive enough in recognizing gendered violence as a justification for refugee status. It's getting better, but it still has a ways to go. So there are legal challenges there, but there are also, I think, kind of public perception challenges that we need to overcome in terms of making clear, that women fleeing this kind of violence are eligible for asylum and refugee status. And then, what can you all do? There's a lot that you can do. First of all, in this current political environment, it is very, very important to speak up. We all have representatives in Congress, and one of the reasons why this piece of legislation did not pass in the Senate was because senators started to hear from their constituents that they did not want to shut the doors to Syrian refugees. And that, it's far more important than what a group like mine says is what a constituent says. And I can tell you from where I work in Washington, I worked in Washington for 30 years, it makes a big difference. Your voice makes a big difference. And people who work in Congress will tell us the tide turned in terms of the calls we were hearing, and that made a difference with the way our boss voted. So you have power, and you should use it. And so speak up, both to your representatives and in your communities. It's really, really important because fear is like a virus, and it spreads, the anxiety. So tamping that down and getting educated about the security system and the vetting for refugees is really important. And to spread that like a virus, and that will help. And then, of course, there are many, many organizations that are kind of doing frontline work, helping refugees get asylum, helping people in camps get food and shelter and clothing. Mike showed the slide, a beautiful story of what greater impact can you have than actually helping a refugee family. And that's possible to do. If you want to learn more about it, you can talk to me. But there's so much that individuals can do. But a big part of it is use your voice. It's really powerful.
Alex,
I'll just be very brief. I think Lisa said a lot of what I would say. Just on the resettlement comes in two ways here. In terms of women in particular, the particular burdens and the vulnerability of women, particularly in the Syrian crisis, but in many other refugee situations, is dramatic. And since the resettlement process is directed at the most vulnerable refugees, it will be directed at vulnerable women. And so maintaining adequate resettlement numbers is a very important way of making sure we pay attention to the special vulnerabilities that women face. I think there's, in terms of legislative changes we can think about, that we could all speak about, this goes to both these points. Canada has a system, I'm saying a lot about Canada today for some reason, but Canada has a system that for years has permitted private sponsorship of refugees, where groups of people, 5 people can get together and say, we will bring someone in. The United States does not, and there have been discussions that are just starting now in Washington about this, and I think it would be really a good idea to push for private sponsorship, where people would say, we will take the responsibility of bringing a person in. They'd still have to be screened on security grounds and the like, but it would be in addition to what the US government is doing. And I think given the generosity of the American people, we could bring in tens of thousands more refugees, with people saying, I want to be a part of that solution. But we need the authority to do that, and that will be a good thing to push for. Just one more. If you want to say what?
No, I was just going to say on that point, I think that's an interesting point. Speaking personally, because the museum does not take political positions, but I do think what I've found over the last year or so is I have had a huge number of questions from people who are supporters, people are interested, young people, like what can I do, what can I do? The question this gentleman said, and I think the lack of a private sponsorship system is a big problem, because I think there is a huge, just from my anecdotal information, I think there's a huge appetite, like from my show in Washington, from other places, to actually be personally involved. We obviously want to be advocates, speak out on whatever political side you take, but I think that actually being able to do something is a very critical thing. I say that from a personal point of view.
And it would help not only in getting, saving more refugees, but it would also create more of a culture of knowing who refugees are. If you listen to some of what the politicians say about the refugee system, it's obvious they've never met a refugee and they have no idea how the system works. And having a system of private sponsorship would also have that added benefit.
I'm sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt your question.
Just that there's more the private sector can do here as well. We tend to think about the refugee system as a state, the government should take care of everything, but there's some really interesting proposals now being made in Europe that I think could also come to the United States, where you could create a platform where refugees could indicate their skills. And employers around the world, certainly in the United States, could look at that and say, we would like to bring those people in, and then work with the government to bring them in, not necessarily as refugees, but as workers. And that's something that, given our, the technology we have now, that's easy to do if people undertake that kind of action. The last thing I'd say, and it went to the first point on the antipathy towards undocumented immigrants. First of all, the last 3 years there's been a net outflow to Mexico. More people have left the country than come in. And you would not know that from the political debate in this country, where statements are made about people pouring across our borders. It's false, and it should be stated that it's false. And so this is Elisa's point, and I just keep coming back to what you hear on the New York subways every day. If you see something, say something. If you see someone saying something that's wrong, say that's wrong. If you see people taking positions about all Muslim people, stand up and say, you can't have that. We know what happens when societies turn on large numbers of people. We've seen that too many times. Not to stand up and say, that is wrong, it has to stop.
One or two more questions that are in front? Yes, sir. Why don't you wait for a microphone?
Probably everybody here knows how Jews still right now in France, in Germany, in Scandinavian countries, practically in every European country. Recently, presidents and staff of Jewish Congress in Europe met with Putin to try the water if they can come from European country to Russia to save their heads. You cannot go with yarmulke on your head right now in Paris. When for service in European country, dozens of police officers supposed to protect you when you go to service in synagogue. What makes you to believe that in America it would be different? In 25 years it would be 5 times more Muslims here and 20% less Jews. So what makes you so optimistic? Particularly speaking Jewish museum.
I just want to make sure
I think the question was that there's been, if I understood that there's been anti-Semitism in virtually all the European countries now, which I think you're saying is sparked in part by the increase of the Muslim refugees, correct? And the question is, if we took in a lot of Muslim refugees, what would prevent there from being increasing anti-Semitism here? Michael, you're right, say something. This is your...
Well, look, first of all, there's not, I think there's definitely, well, I've got a couple data points. There's a huge increase, it seems to me, in anti-Semitism in Europe going on right now. I think the influx of refugees in Germany is causing concerns that it could get worse. I think that's a fair concern. I think that my sense is, and Elisa's group has done some really good reporting on anti-Semitism in Europe and France in particular, but also in Hungary and Greece, that my sense is a big problem. I think also that the governments in Europe, particularly in France and Germany, are on top of the problem. They're monitoring carefully. They're putting a lot of security into this issue. I'm not saying it's not a problem, but my sense is that the governments in Europe are reacting pretty forcefully to that problem. I don't know if you agree with that, Elisa.
Well, it's a complex problem, I think, and while no question that Human Rights First just released 2 weeks ago a big report on the rise of anti-Semitism in France. And we tried there to dissect the problem, which is quite complex. And I think it's a mistake to attribute it entirely or even primarily to the growth of Muslim immigration by itself. There are lots of factors. That's one of them, and it interacts with the rise of the far right in France, but also in other countries, and how those movements, if you will, feed off of each other, all to the detriment of Jews' safety and Jewish life in Europe. So it's a serious problem. I think actually one of the advantages of the United States that the United States has is that we have done largely a much better job of integration of immigrants of all faiths and all nationalities. Of course we can do better, but you don't see the same kinds of problems. We still have anti-Semitic hate crime is still the highest of all hate crimes in the United States as well. So we have our own problems here already. But I think on the whole, we've done a better job of integrating immigrant populations into the fabric of our society, and that is a big part of the solution, I think, to that challenge.
One more final question. How about the gentleman back there, and then I see a question there, and I think that should do it.
Hi. When I first heard about this panel, I was very hesitant about the connections that could be drawn between the Holocaust and the current refugee crisis, and you mentioned before that you wanted to put the Holocaust aside when talking about current refugee crises. I was wondering first why you mentioned that, and second, if you could speak for a moment about why you feel that it's important to have this kind of panel in a museum such as this, and why it's a Jewish question that we're trying to answer today.
Well, I didn't say put it aside. I said I wasn't going to make a comparison. I think those kinds of historical comparisons just, I don't want to get into those kinds of comparisons. I think that's a fair thing to say. I think you have a conference like this or a discussion like this in a Jewish museum because I think there are deep Jewish values about taking care of strangers and about healing the world. I think that's at the heart of Judaism I understand. And so these are crucial issues about the lives of other human beings. We were all strangers in the land of Egypt. I think we've all heard that many, many, many times in our lives.
How would it be decided where refugees would settle in the United States? And is it the local governments of those prospective places that are against having refugees settle there because they're afraid of economic competition with local residents or afraid of taxes having to be raised to provide services?
If I can answer, the way the refugee resettlement system works in this country is a really interesting model. Refugees are spread all around the country. There are 9 major, we call them voluntary agencies, that helps the government resettle refugees. 7 of them are religiously based, 2 are not. And they take people all around the country. So the numbers of refugees in any one community will be very small. It won't have that kind of dramatic impact. Now, once someone comes in, you can't stop them from moving around. So one thing you've seen is many Somali refugees, for example, have moved to Lewiston, Maine, of all places, and there has been some tension there. And that has to be worked out then through at the local level. But in general, other than that kind of odd example, it's very hard to find significant concentrations of refugees that would have that kind of deleterious effect on schools or other kinds of public services. Remember, we're talking about resettlement even in a good year of 50 or 60 or 70,000 refugees in a country of 320 million people. So it's really not that, it would be very hard to show that kind of impact.
Elisa, just a question on like how it's decided where refugees would go once they resettle. How does that work?
Well, as Alex said, there are these agencies, and they have relationships in different places. Most of them are faith-based. Lutheran Immigration Services, HIAS, the Hebrew Immigrant Aid Society, International Rescue Committee, the Catholic Relief Services, and they have community relationships, and that's how they decide where. And they do try to find where people may have relatives or where there's some. There are some bizarre things like Somalis going to Minnesota where the weather seems like it would be kind of a little bit of a challenge, but they do try to find places where they would be welcomed. And that's a big, I think that if you're going to get to take from the very local to the bigger picture, since we're coming to a close, that key to developing a system that really reflects our values as a country in terms of welcoming the stranger, is to have a broader experience with refugees, who refugees are. I can tell you from my own experience as a young lawyer, representing refugees from Central America and from really all over the world. So one of the most profound and moving experiences of my life, and I have maintained friendships and relationships with people who came here decades ago, who have added so much both to my life and to the communities in which they live. So the local experience with refugees is a really, really important one to build that fabric of compassion and support that we need.
Just one wonderful example of this is, I guess most of you probably know Chobani yogurt. Maybe it's in your refrigerator. You've certainly seen it on your shelves. Chobani yogurt was started by a Turkish Kurd, Hamdi Yulukaya, who moved to upstate New York. And there's a belt of the cities, Schenectady and Utica, the cities that have been losing population. And some of them have taken in significant numbers of refugees because they've been seen as an engine for reviving these so-called legacy cities, I think, as they're now known. So Yulukaya started Chobani yogurt. He bought an old yogurt factory and took 3 or 4 years to develop this new Greek-style yogurt. And he went to the local employment people and he said, I want to hire refugees. And so half his workforce in the beginning in Chobani were refugees that he employed. And he's now made this pledge, like the billionaires do, to devote half of his wealth, which is in the many, many millions and whatever's, to the refugee cause. And that came from the work that he had done with refugees in upstate New York.
In closing, I wanted to just circle back to something Alex said, which said something very eloquent, I thought, about Jewish values. But just circling back into the question back there about, why is this studying a Holocaust museum? I think Alex made a very correct point that the Holocaust was a unique event in human history. It's very dangerous typically to, make comparisons to what happened there. I think the point I was trying to make at the beginning is that these issues, these are not just issues that have surfaced today. They recur throughout American history. And I think it's very useful to look to the past, for some, for guidance. If you forget about the past, it's very dangerous. And I really believe there's a huge debate right now, obviously, or since the Holocaust, about the American role. I don't want to reprise that debate, but the reality is that the one thing that we could have done in the 1930s to save more Jews was to allow more refugees out. We had very strict quotas, and even the quotas that we did have went unfilled during the period of the 1930s. So I think that should be very sobering for policymakers today, just to know that decisions that you make today can have big consequences in the future. And so I do think there's a connection.
Well, and I think the chart that you showed, Michael, was really very interesting of the steps that were taken in the 30s to keep Jewish refugees out, and it was done not through rules saying you can't come in, but through bureaucratic delay. It was very intentional. The desire was to slow that down and not let people in and make it difficult for people to come in. And
it looks very similar
well, that's
to
what
the
I'm
chart
saying.
that I have about today.
What I'm saying now is that I think some of the rhetoric about slowing down the admission of Syrians for concerns about security, some of that I think is legitimate. You have to do security checks. But the idea that the legislation that was passed in the House and defeated in the Senate required a signature of the Secretary of HS, of the Attorney General. It was not done as a way to make sure security is better improved. It was done as a way to use bureaucratic processes to stop the flow of refugees. And in that way, there is a similarity there, I think.
So anyway, thank you all for coming. I want to thank the Museum of Jewish Heritage for hosting us.